Hello, today we're going to learn a little bit about our asher we have here in the Keck Lab. So one might ask, why would we use an asher? Typically for our purposes, we like to use an asher when we have a sample that's really rich in organic material. And so this is a good way to kick up the temperature and get rid of some of that organic material. One of the reasons you might not want to use this is perhaps you do want to get rid of organic material, but you don't want to volatilize some of the elements that you're interested in. This would be a bad approach, but for typical things we do in the lab, sometimes this works pretty well. So this is our asher. This is the inside of the asher. The first thing you're going to want to do when you want to use the asher is go ahead and sign up on our sign-in sheet. It is here in yellow. And so you must fill it in. And it just has some basic information, your name, the date, the time you started. Typically we run this overnight. The hours of usage, the materials used in the equipment, and that's important for people who are worried about contamination and whatnot. Or it's also nice to know what has been through the asher. What temperature you ran the asher at, which will depend upon your sample, as well as some emergency contact information, your phone number. For our purposes today, we're going to ash some salt. And so when we put things inside the asher, we like to use what we call crucibles. These are our crucibles. There is a basic strategy you'll want to apply when you are using crucibles. For instance, it's really nice when you can find a crucible that's really glossy. You can see the lid of this crucible is very glossy. There's probably not a whole lot of things that are going to stick to it. If you actually open it up, you'll see that it's also glossy inside. It's nice and pretty. That's a good one to use. In comparison, we have a somewhat not so good crucible, and if you look closely, you might not be able to see it in the camera, but the gloss is not there. And so there is a chance that this crucible will, you won't be able to get your sample out of it as easily. It's also important when you're putting your samples in the asher to know which samples are which, and so to annotate that, we will actually mark directly on the crucible. Important thing to know is when you make your mark on the crucible, after you've baked your crucible in the oven, that marking will no longer be there when it comes out. More than likely it'll be gone. And so it's also, in addition to marking on the crucible what the sample is, you also want to make a note. When I do it inside of my, my lab notebook, where in the asher my samples sit. And so for instance here, we'll say S1, we'll call that sample 1. And so naturally, the next step is then to load our sample into the crucible. One nice strategy to use is to put a chem wipe below your crucible, so if any of your sample does spill, it's not going to get on our counter. It'll be easier to clean up. But I like to keep the crucible and the crucible cap on the chem wipe. And it's actually really important when you do this that you want to measure how much sample you're putting in your crucible. This is something you're going to want to not only just look at, you're going to want to write this down in your notebook. You're going to need this when you actually get your data off of the machine or wherever you're going to do with it. And so one way to do this here is we don't necessarily care about the weight of the crucible. I only want to know the weight of the sample. So I'll actually I'll zero the weight of the crucible. So any sample I add will register on the weight on the scale there, and it won't worry about the weight of the crucible. So here, let's just pretend we want 20 milligrams of salt. And so you actually want to use these spatulas. These are nice. They're quick and they're disposable, and so you don't have to really worry about contamination. Before I do this, a lot of the times I'll actually wear gloves, and so it's important to put gloves on in this step. Now we are ready to weigh our sample. Grab one of these nice disposable spatulas. I like to prime my trash can for disposal. And again, we're going to let's try for 20 milligrams. We'll see how good I am at this. All right. So a good rule is to start with a little bit to see how much mass is in a certain amount of scoop. Salt seems to be tricky compared to what I'm usually measuring out. I might even be way over at this point. Yeah, so there, we're at about 70 milligrams already. So I'm very bad at measuring salt, it turns out. A better strategy may have been to start with even less sample and work my way up. So again, once you have your weight, you need to actually register that weight, put it in your lab notebook, make note of it. You're going to need that weight to get accurate measurements for your elements of interest in our lab. So then your crucible, it's marked, it's got the sample in it, it's ready to go into the asher. I'm right-handed, so I like to start at the back left corner and then put samples in sequentially. You want to keep in mind that the crucibles will tip over. Those lids aren't screw tight or anything like that. And so you want to put a crucible, put them in an order where you're not going to bump the other ones. So this strategy has worked for me. If you're left-handed, you might want to start from the opposite end, the top right. This sample name is not going to get retained after you've ashed it in the asher. And so you're going to want to annotate again in your lab notebook where that sample was in the asher. And so one of the strategies I employ in my lab notebook is we have a nice rectangular plate in there, and I'll just do something like this. S1, top left corner. And then as you enter more samples in, you'll mark their locations. So when the asher opens up, after you've ran it overnight, and your sample markings aren't gone, the world isn't over. We are now ready to start our asher. For some of the samples I use, a lot of the time we ash them at 550 degrees. The first step that's important to do is to close the vent on the top of the asher. I want this asher to be at 550 degrees C. If this flap at the top, this vent is open, it will never get to that temperature, or it'll try really hard all night to do so. And so what I'll do is, I like to use these tongs because sometimes this is hot, especially if someone ran it before I did. And you just put the flap over the vent. Intuitively, if it's covering it, it'll stop it from venting. And I'll also throw these are kind of just as weights, paper weights for the vent. One will do the job here, but it keeps the flap closed so it won't vent. And so you'll go ahead and you'll turn on the asher, and it's going to tell you when you first turn it on the temperature that's inside the asher right now. Right now it's 21 C, that is room temperature. But we don't want it at room temperature, we want it at 550 C. And so we'll actually, this button that says push to set temp, you press and hold that, and that'll tell you the temperature at which it's going to try and heat. And so, somebody before me was running maybe similar samples or just doing a similar protocol. They want their samples at 550 as well. If this wasn't the case and the temperature was even lower, you would use this dial and ramp it up or down to the temperature that you want. Let's pretend that we've ran the asher overnight. It is the next day. The first thing I like to do is, when I come in the morning, I like to come in and remove the weight off of the flap, use the tongs. This time the flap will be hot, for sure, and I will move the flap to let it vent. You'll also at this time want to turn off the asher. By turning it off, it will no longer heat. By opening up the vent, the heat that's in there will go away. And so you just want this to sit for quite a long time as you wait for it to ramp down in temperature. One strategy I like to use is after it's been cooling in the morning for a couple hours, I'll come back in and I'll slowly open the hatch. And this will allow your samples to cool a lot more quickly. And so then, even at that point though, the crucibles are still very hot. I'll let it sit with the door open for another hour at least. And then after that hour is over, I'll come back in, and my samples should be ready to be taken out the next day. Sample names will be gone. So that's where I'll need to look back at my notes and see what sample was in the upper left-hand corner. That was sample S1. And so what I like to do actually is, as I take my samples out of the asher, as good practice again, I'll put them back on a chem wipe. And what I will do is I will remark them, because I'm going to use this sample again. I want to know what sample name it is. I don't have as good of a memory as it would take to memorize 30 samples. And so once all my samples have been remarked, for my purposes, my samples will go back in the clean lab for a lot of the things I do. I will put them in this holding space, this kind of purgatory, where samples that have been ashed are ready to be weighed out inside the clean lab for digestion. And so that concludes today's lesson on the asher.